I'm David Lampton. I had China Studies at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and I want to thank Dr. Huang and the U.S. China Policy Foundation and Ernestine for not only putting together this event, but doing so much to strengthen U.S.-China relations, and particularly work with Capitol Hill and the staff has been one of the particularly important things that's been done. So I want to acknowledge their support in general of the relationship and their sponsorship of this evening and their thanks for all their service to our country. Also, I wanted to say just up front how important the topic is we have to discuss. I think the fact you're here is a recognition of the fact of its importance, and I think this issue is not going away anytime soon. I think this is a long-term protected issue that we'll be talking about at considerable length for a protracted period. Each of the panelists here is an expert on one or another facets of China's domestic economy, society, politics, and so I'm going to ask each of them to just make very brief opening remarks on that aspect of the corruption problem that they think is most significant, and then in answering your questions, they'll weave in other things as appropriate. So I'm asking each not to speak for more than 7 minutes, and then that will leave us adequate time for questions for a few that may wish to stay later. At least some of us have a little time, and we'd be glad to continue the interaction. Now, what I'd like to do is just briefly introduce everybody, and then we'll just sort of in comments go down the row. But we really do have a distinguished group with us. To my immediate left is Christopher K. Johnson. He's Senior Advisor and holds the Freeman Chair in China Studies at CSIS. Chris spent nearly 2 decades serving in the U.S. government, intelligence, and foreign affairs communities. He has frequently advised senior White House cabinet, congressional, military, and foreign officials on the Chinese leadership and on Beijing's foreign and security policies. Chris has worked as a senior China analyst for the Central Intelligence Agency and served as an intelligence liaison to 2 secretaries of state and their deputies on the worldwide security issues, including those in 2011 was awarded the U.S. State Department's Deputy Superior Honor Award for outstanding support to the Secretary and her, so I guess this is Secretary Clinton, for his excellent work. Chris graduated summa cum laude with a bachelor's degrees in history and political science from the University of California, San Diego, and received his MA in security policies from George Washington University. Next to him is Yukon Huang, and he's a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment in Washington. And prior to joining Carnegie, he was at the World Bank as country director for China. His research focuses on China's economy and financial prospects and its global impact. He was the principal advisor for the joint Chinese government World Bank China 2030 report. Yukon has published widely on development issues affecting China. He is also an A-list commentator for the Financial Times on China, and articles are seen in the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, CNN, New York Times, and Foreign Affairs. He has his PhD in economics from Princeton and his BA from Yale. Next to him is Professor Bruce Dickson, and Bruce is research and teaching focus on politics and the dynamics of politics in China, especially the adaptability of the Chinese Communist Party and the regime it governs. His current research examines the political consequences of economic reform in China, the Chinese Communist Party's evolving strategy for survival, and the changing relationship between state and society based in part on national public opinion surveys. His research has been supported by the National Science Foundation, Smith Richardson Foundation, the U.S. Institute of Peace, and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And last but not least, on my left, your right, is Dr. Sasha Blum. Sasha is a Harvard-trained scholar, sociologist, author, and former political activist who now heads VOA's China branch. And we were just talking, and I was so pleased to find out the listenership has gone up 22 times under her tutelage. So I thought that was pretty impressive. She's a longtime supporter of free media, and Sasha secretly listened to Voice of America broadcasts as a young woman growing up in China. During China's Cultural Revolution, she took part in the underground protests against the regime. Her activities led to 11 months in solitary confinement. Following release from prison, she went to the university in China and later pursued a PhD in sociology at Harvard University. Before joining VOA, she helped found Radio Free Asia's Cantonese service and ran for a seat in the Virginia House of Delegates in 2009. She has authored several books, including Born American, A Chinese Woman's Dream of Liberty, and The Cultural Revolution Cookbook, both of which include her memories of China. So let me just ask Chris to speak. Just let me pose a few questions that I'd like everybody, both in the audience and in the panel, to think about in terms of corruption. One is, we've got a campaign going on. It's been going on for 2 years. How will we know success when we see it? What is a successful anti-corruption campaign in China? What could it look like? A second set of issues is, we can all see I think the upside of cleaning up corruption in China, but are there some downsides that we need to think about? For instance, if it's prematurely ended, will this lead to popular frustration and actually make a legitimacy weaker? Is Xi Jinping using the campaign not only to clean up corruption, but in the process get rid of competitive political networks and other bureaucratic or regional bases of power? How is the foreign business community going to both react to it, and to what degree will it be affected by it? And is this part of an environment, short term at least, that's strengthening the business environment or making China less attractive in some sense because it's less predictable and more dangerous to operate in a business sense? Finally, to what degree are we running the risk of having bureaucrats and others sort of keep their head low, not be very innovative, and with the idea of reducing their own personal exposure to a campaign that's still not entirely transparent and its directions unknown? So I think there are lots of questions here. I won't go on, but ask Chris to speak. But we'll, by the end of your initial remarks and your questions, hopefully we'll be down the road to understanding Chris.
Great. Thank you, Mike, and great to be here. Thank the organizers for putting it together. In 6.5 minutes, I'm going to try to answer a few of those questions. I'll leave aside the issue of what does success look like for now, but I think we'll get into that. I kind of wanted to tackle 3 issues that I think are questions themselves in how to understand what's happening. The first is, what is the corruption campaign about? This is a question that is asked frequently, and I think there's been an unfortunate tendency among analysts to kind of look for a single answer, if you will, when in fact anything like this that is complex in the way that it's complex is about many things. And I think with Xi Jinping, I like to refer to it as his multi-layered cake of motivation for the for the campaign. I think at the elite level, the so-called tiger hunt level, it is very much about power politics. It's been very striking that strangely enough, no one close to Xi Jinping or anyone in that sort of so-called princeling group of individuals has fallen in the course of the campaign so far, and that it has been very focused on former presidents, both Jiang Zemin and even Hu Jintao's network, and other powerful actors inside the system. So certainly I think at that tiger level there's a very strong component of this power grab, if you will. In the military and the security services, I think it's slightly different, and we can get into that further, maybe in the Q&A, as to what it means. And then there's the so-called fly level, or the lower level, and I think there the motivation is very different than at the elite level. There, I think it really is about the ugly face of the regime, if you will, that the common people of China see every day. the rapacious local official, the rapacious local police official who shakes people down for various reasons, the child of a local official who drives through the streets in some brightly colored Italian sports car and mows down a lot of people and and is not punished, these sort of issues. And I think Xi Jinping, very much sees this as very deleterious, right, to the party. And I think there's a very strong, almost messianic component to Xi Jinping, where he does see himself very much as the savior of the party, and he sees this as integral to saving the party. And then I think he views the process as a natural precursor, in fact a necessary precursor, to being able to do these very ambitious reforms that he laid out at the third plenum, right? And a sense that if you don't, if you will, prepare the ground with this kind of anti-corruption work, those reforms are guaranteed to be successful, and you might end up repeating something like what happened in the Soviet Union and then Russia, with a series of kleptocratic oligarchs taking over state assets, this sort of thing. So I think that's clearly part of what it's about. Second question, when will it end? This is something that gets asked a lot. And is it even fair to call it a campaign anymore? Because campaigns end at some point. There's a lot of debate about this, and I think people, again, have a tendency to oversimplify perhaps, and to sort of say, when are we going to exit the destructive phase, anti-corruption, and enter the constructive phase of moving toward reform? And I would argue that, at least from Xi Jinping's point of view, those two things are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they go very closely together. You can't do one without the other. And I also think the regime has been actually quite transparent about how long this is going to last. At the sort of traditional cycle, when they came back from Beidaihe in 2013, and they had the standard Politburo meeting, and they announced the dates for the plenum, and everyone thought, wow, third plenum, that's going to be important. They focused on that. They missed the fact that they also announced that they had a 5-year anti-corruption plan running through 2017. So at a minimum, it's going to go at least that long. And I think it will probably go longer. And that means that this will be sustained. And I think the other piece of that is that, surprisingly, shockingly, and this speaks to some of your questions, it still appears to be the case that not everyone's getting it, that this is sustained. Some of these internal speeches that she has supposedly given that have been leaked kind of talk to this issue and sort of say, one of the key targets in the campaign is the memo to all of you who haven't gotten it yet, that this is serious. I like to call these people candidates for Darwin's waiting room, but they're still there. And this is an ongoing, and she, I think, has to continue to validate the campaign. And then the last question kind of speaks to a couple of your questions, which is it harmful in some way? And I think the clearest evidence here, and I'm actually very keen to hear Yukon's thoughts, is it is harmful to the economy. I think they're discovering, as one senior official told me, they didn't recognize how dependent the economy in certain sectors, especially luxury goods, things like this, were dependent on cadres, which was kind of surprising to me that they didn't know that, but clearly they did not. And I think what we're seeing here in recent months is the group of detractors, critics, whatever you want to call them, the people who are probably being the biggest victims of the anti-corruption campaign, their narrative early on to kind of push back against the anti-corruption campaign was that, it's a mad power grab by Xi Jinping, and he's a megalomaniac like Mao, and therefore dangerous and will crash the party. I think that got some traction in some elite circles, but not much. I think what we see now with the economy decelerating rapidly, much more rapidly, obviously, than they initially expected, that group has modified that narrative. And the narrative now is that the aggressive pursuit of the anti-corruption campaign is shaving an additional, whatever you want to say, point and a half off of GDP, and that ultimately undermines their justification to continued one-party rule. And my sense is, from my last trip there, that this narrative is gaining some traction, and that the detractors like this narrative because it's out of Xi Jinping's control to some degree. The economy is the economy, and it'll do what it'll do. So I do think it's harmful in that regard. It's also harmful in another way in that it has caused, pick your term, I use near paralysis in the system with regard to decision making. As you were pointing out, local officials don't want to put their head up, they don't want to take risks, and they certainly don't want to approve deals, and that has real impacts for the business community. So I'll stop there. And
well, thank you, Chris. Yukon.
Thanks. That was a very good survey, Chris. I'm going to try to complement your presentation by focusing on economic aspects, which I'm an economist. Indirectly, I think I'm going to be addressing the issues that David posed. Let me basically begin by saying what you read about corruption is very complicated. There are many factors. There's so many solutions. How can you make heads or tails of this subject? So let me start by trying to simplify the discussion. What is corruption? Corruption, by an economist, is the use of public office for personal gain. So it's not two private people. They may be immoral, they may be illegal, but that's not corruption. You have to have the public involved. Let me use this definition to look at corruption and answer three interesting questions. Economists basically argue that corruption retards growth. If that's the case, why has China grown so rapidly? Did it grow because of corruption, or did it grow in spite of corruption? Second, most developed rich countries, corruption comes down. Corruption is supposed to moderate the richer you are and the faster you grow. In China's case, corruption is getting worse the richer they are. So even on these first two questions, China seems to defy the standard ways we look at it. In fact, economist studies, China always comes out as the outlier. It doesn't fit. Third, how do you address the systemic causes of corruption? Here you actually, and most people conclude, you need a degree of political liberalization. What do we mean by that? How do we know when it's going to occur, and when will it occur, and why will it occur? Now, I'm going to talk about this from an economist viewpoint, not as a political scientist, so it's going to be slightly different. Let me go back to the person who started this all, Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping came forward with two major propositions: open up and reform. He created the dual economy in China, a market economy and a centrally planned economy side by side. And later I'll explain corruption is inevitable. Second, he basically said, to get rich is glorious. And of course, he meant that if you work very hard, this is great, and you make a lot of money. He didn't mean that you could make money illegally. But legally, illegally, that was the tenet. So what he did was he launched the dual economy. And what is the dual economy? The dual economy has three players. Player one is a private entrepreneur. Deng basically told him, go out there and make money, produce. And he sees the possibility. He wants to produce something new, better than the old centralized economy. But he has no resources. So he finds where the resources are, and the resources are controlled by player number two. He's usually a manager and an SOE. The SOE controls the land, the money, the capital. The two start to get together and figure out how I should do something. But player A and player B, they can't succeed without player C. And player C is the local official party member, because only he can bless this arrangement. So the three of them can collude. And they collude and bribe and share, and they strike arrangements in a centralized system, highly regulated, but it makes it function. And they get away with it, of course, because Deng basically said we must grow rapidly. So as long as you collude, but grow rapidly, it's fine. And that means investment must surge. So every official has a goalpost, a performance target. Investment must go up. Growth must be high. And if you do this, it's fine. A lot of money is made in this process, because the more money you make, the more money you can share it. So the more rapidly China grows, the more corruption grows in this particular system, because of the way incentives are structured. Now, how do you deal with this? Because it's actually not growth inhibiting, it actually generates more growth. And the answer, of course, the problem is a moral problem. It creates a sense of injustice, unfairness in China. It jeopardizes the legitimacy of the Communist Party. So there you have Xi Jinping coming through. Because corruption campaigns are almost always led by moralists. They target extravagant expenditures, bribery, corruption. They increase the penalties. Now, why do they increase the penalties? More people go to jail, more people get executed. There's been an economic study which showed that of the corrupt people, only 3% go to jail. So it's a low-risk, high-payoff profession. However, if I execute a few people, I've changed the odds. So the moralists are basically going along that line. Now, you have the premier and you have others, those who are dealing with what I call the economic aspects. What do they focus on? The regulations, the bureaucracy. And what are they both groups trying to get at? The biggest source of corruption in China today is the control over inputs of production. That's a very technical economic term. What do I mean by inputs of production? Land, energy, capital, labor. All three of these inputs of production are controlled. Therefore, they're ripe for rent-seeking activities. Land is being expropriated, taken away from farmers, developed and sold, fortune being made. Energy, split markets, differential prices, controlled, fortunes being made. No wonder Xi Jinping has targeted the energy corporations as his first target. Capital, subsidized for state enterprises, local authorities, siphoned off and goes to the private sector. No wonder Chairman of the central bank wants to free up interest rates. Labor. Now, why is labor a source of corruption? Because labor can't move in China. And you have restrictions about residency, so hukou policy becomes a big issue. You can buy a hukou in Beijing for 200,000 renminbi. Have you ever thought of the fact that you could buy residency and it has a price? All three of these factors are production of the source of corruption in China, and they're the source of government reform agenda. So the link between reform and corruption is not accidental. They're actually basically interrelated, and they have to be solved. Now, how do you deal with the political liberalization, and is it necessary? My favorite example is the example of a Chinese dining chair. Think of the Chinese economy as a dining table, a big round table, and the table is the economy. It's held together by a central pillar. That's a dining table, Chinese dining table. This is an extraordinarily successful growth model because that pillar is the composition of the party, the government, banks, enterprises, but all fused together, partly for corruption purposes, partly for coordination purposes, but a really effective growth engine. Now, what does this Chinese dining table have to do? It has to become a Western table. It has to be split up into a square. It has to have 4 legs. The party, the government, enterprises, and firms have to be split up. That's a big political issue, and that requires political liberalization. I've run out of time, but I can give you later, perhaps, an economist's interpretation of how that's going to occur, when it's going to occur, and why it's going to occur. But let me stop here.
Thank you, Yukon. Bruce.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about kind of the public's reaction to the corruption campaign, and to do so, mention some findings from public opinion surveys that were done on a nationwide basis. First back in 2010, before the campaign began, and the most recent one last year, end of last year, to look at how the public is evaluating things today. And the bottom line that I want to emphasize is that this anti-corruption campaign may be good for Xi Jinping because he gets credit for it and it's a popular campaign, but it may be damaging for the party in the long run. So let me talk about why those two things may coexist. One of the common questions in public opinion surveys is how, what is the nature of corruption in your community? Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? Is it about the same? And in the 2010 survey, people were equally divided between those three things, better, worse, or about the same. In last year, when the survey was done, almost 60% of the people thought it was getting better. People were able to see with the less common banquets that local officials were hosting, the more careful use of limos and other use of public funds, they saw tangible proof that the anti-corruption campaign was having an effect. And so this is good for President Xi because he's been the main promoter of the campaign. But it's also bad for the CCP because people have begun to realize exactly how extensive corruption is throughout the party and throughout the government and throughout the military. People always knew that corruption existed, and especially at the local level, but now with the focus on tigers in the campaign, the high-level officials who are implicated, people get a better understanding about exactly how widespread it may be. So back in 2010, less than half of the people in the survey would say that corruption was either somewhat or extensive at the central level, but in 2014, 70% of the people thought the same thing. So a big increase in the percentage of people who saw corruption being a problem at the central level. The local level is not much of a change. They always thought local officials were corrupt. And so there's a slight increase there, but not very extensive. Now you would think with all the attention given to corruption throughout the years that this wouldn't come as a big surprise, but most of the attention was focused on local officials. There are very few high-level people who were targeted, who were punished. whose exploits were broadcast as widely as they have been in the most recent campaign. And so in that sense, people have begun to realize exactly how pervasive this problem is and how well entrenched it is at the top of the system. In terms of what explains the degree of support that people may have for the status quo, for the regime as a whole, the more pervasive you think corruption is, the less support you have, the less trust you have in the existing institutions. We often hear about economic factors, performance legitimacy as a basis for the party's legitimacy, as much as rising prosperity, as much as your own incomes are increasing, has an influence on your attitude toward the regime. Your perception about corruption has an opposite and equal impact on perceptions of legitimacy. So in terms of public opinion, this campaign is kind of changing attitudes, especially about the central level, in terms of how pervasive it is, and has a larger impact on their general attitudes toward the regime as a whole. A second way that corruption is bad for the CCP comes from the personal experience of people involved in corruption. In the 2014 survey, about 20% of the respondents said that they had personally given a bribe to an official. This is not like given to doctors or teachers. That would be a different type of activity, but actually given a bribe to an official for some purpose. About 20% of the respondents reported they had done so. Another 28% said they knew a friend or family member who had done so. And so just as corruption is seen as a widespread problem, it's a supply and demand issue, right? So if there's people who are receiving bribes, there's lots of people giving bribes too, either on a large scale like businessmen or a small scale for everyday Chinese. Those who paid bribes also had less support for the regime than people who did not give bribes. So not just the perception that corruption is a problem, your personal experience led you to have less support for the regime than people who did not pay bribes. So this is having, just as it's having a positive impact perhaps for Xi, for the popular support for him as president and head of the party, it's also having a damaging effect on the regime and for the party's reputation in particular. At the beginning of the reform era, party elder Chen Yun was reported to have said that if the party did not fight corruption enough, it would destroy the country, but if it dealt with it too much, it would destroy the party. And here's an example where it may be having this kind of a negative impact on the party just by publicizing how pervasive it is, by punishing the wrongdoers. It has the perhaps unintended but not too surprising consequence that now people realize how bad it is, and it's tarnishing the reputation of the party. But at the same time, it has a lingering effect that the dilemma that Xi faces, as Chris mentioned, the more this is seen as just a vendetta against Xi's potential opposition and not really addressing corruption, the more cynicism it creates and therefore further damaging popular support for the regime. In terms of what we see as an indicator of success, if they don't make any institutional changes, change the incentives for corruption or incentives against corruption, then there's no reason for the people who are engaging in corruption in the past to go back to what they're doing, hoping they're not going to be part of the 3% that gets caught. If you don't change the institutional arrangements, you're not likely to change the behavior. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Sasha.
Thank you. It's very enlightening. Well, media and corruption is a very big subject, I have to say, and it should include like media, corruption in the media, or media's role in anti-corruption campaign, or how the media report corruption. And each of them is big enough to be a book subject, so I'm just trying to summarize a little bit. To say that, I would like to start from a very long, some small incident, long memory, long time ago. When Bo Xilai was in Peking University History Department, we studied together. And one day we talked about what we want to do in the future. I said, I wanted to be a professor. That turned out to be wrong. And he said, my dream was to be a reporter of the Xinhua News Agency stationing abroad. And that was his dream, and he never did that before, but that's why he went to the Media Institute in China, in Beijing. And in that time, that actually, what I want to say from this example is that working for the media, especially working for the central media, is a very, very privileged job. They are part of the power structure, and they are a very important part of power structure, and media is, after all, the mouthpiece of the Chinese Communist Party. So when it comes to corruption and media, it's interlinked in many ways. So I remember last July, and one day, the CCTV, one of the most popular CCTV programs, when it went on air, and it was a co-anchor program. One anchor disappeared. It was a 36-year-old male anchor, Rui Chenggang. He disappeared. And his co-anchor did not even explain what happened. It's just the guy never exists. And the guy turned out to be arrested. And at the same time, two female anchors and several producers and directorate level producers were also arrested in CCTV. And very soon, the news turned out to be all those, the leaders in the CCTV and the anchors, those female anchors especially, were mistresses of the high-ranking corrupted officials, especially Zhou Yongkang. And when you look at China, look at the corruption report, you often see, when you go to at local level, city, provincial, you often see that the female anchors of the local stations were somehow linked, have relationships with the corrupted official. It has become very big news in China, and it indicates, as people say, corruption in the media. And the corruption in the media, of course, this is the most sensational part. The less sensational part, but also very known practice, was we are not talking about, we talk about using public office, as Professor Huang said, public office for personal gain, and all the party leaders were doing that. But if you think enterprises, and they pay media to get better report or to uncover some good report, or to suppress some bad report. Several Chinese reporters wrote in their personal blog. They said, well, when there was a big disaster happen, the first thing, when the reporters got there, the first thing they got is a little red bag with cash in it, which means please don't report, or please report it in sort of gives us some good word. So corruption in media is very, very prevalent and very profound. And that's just a very known fact. And the reason for that is media is part of the government entity. If the government is corrupt, the media is as well. And in how much time I have?
2 more minutes.
Okay. I quickly wrap it up. in the recent years, when the anti-corruption campaign started, we also saw the media report of corruption in the media grow very rapidly. You see every day media report about corruption here, corruption there, but the whole undertone was still the great party, the party did this, the party is cleaning itself. That's one part you see. But within all the media, when we expand the meaning of media, you also see what the Chinese call self-media. The bloggers, the tweets, and that media, that is the media grow very rapidly. That media actually is taking on the role of the traditional media in our sense, the media sense. So lots of corruption cases were exposed by the self-media before they were reported. And several very prominent figures, party figures, were actually dragged down, what they say, by the self-media. So what you see in China is the parallel. On the one hand, you see the state media is still very, very controlled by the government, is still serving as the mouthpiece of the government. On the other hand, you see a new media. The new media grow very fast and serve as the traditional media role in the sense of Western democracy. So from that, I see some hope in China.
Thank you very much. I think we've had a tour de horizon in brief presentations here. Want to encourage you all to ask questions. I will try to be equitable in choosing questions. While you're thinking of one, I think one that might tie together and provide a segue to the audience participation is the question of, I think Bruce, you mentioned punishment and institutions. And of course, many of the people that are being accused, and I think this is what we have to say, accused of corruption, are in fact being processed by a party administrative rule in a non-transparent circumstance. And therefore, I would think the public couldn't be entirely sure that once you begin to pull the thread, they follow it to the logical conclusion. What constitutes evidence and all of that is, of course, unknown. So can this really be effective unless you build an independent judicial system in some respect that's seen by the public to be somewhat independent from the people bringing the accusations? Or does it just compound the cynicism?
Well, this has been one of the issues for the party ever since it gained power in '49, is not allowing any other watchdog over it. It's the nature of the Leninist party to not allow other organizations to have equal power, equal stature to challenge it. Corruption has been a problem identified as such throughout the post-Mao period, and they've consistently refused to allow any other organization to actually be a watchdog. At the local level, the inspection organizations are actually under the jurisdiction of the people they're designed to investigate. So it's obviously not designed to deal effectively with it. The CDIC is not seen as a particularly powerful organization. At least it wasn't until Wang Qishan became head of it. And so now it seems like it does have a little more bite to it. But it's still much more in terms of punishment than it is about preventing it in the first place. And the fact that it's much more, it's not a transparent process. One of the best indicators of this is as a consequence of the anti-corruption campaign, China's ranking in the Transparency International Index has actually fallen because it's seen as being a non-transparent process. It's not moving toward anything like a rule of law. It seems to be very politically motivated, and therefore it's actually fallen as a consequence of the campaign and not improved at least the international perception of corruption in China.
Mm-hmm. I would just say and wonder about a comment then. You said that the party's never allowed external validation, policing, so to speak. Of course, there's one big exception, and that's when Mao mobilized the streets in the Cultural Revolution on the party. And of course, mass mobilization then
Not
runs
a good
its own.
precedent.
Huh? That runs its own risk. So what seems to be happening here is things are taken down like this dome video and so on quite rapidly. There's a fear on the one hand if you want to engage people, but you don't want them too engaged and mobilized. And so I wonder if there's any risk of what you might call from the party's viewpoint excessive mobilization. Anyway, the audience. Yes, sir. Please identify yourself. And
my name is Huang. I'm from Washington Chinese Daily News. Do you know any U.S. cooperation with the Xi administration for the anti-corruption campaign, such as locating perpetrator or corruption assets in the United States? The second question is the consensus seems that the campaign has economic impact to some degree. Does that impact extend to U.S.-China trade?
Yukon, you wanna, please.
Well, on your first question about whether China is seeking out collaboration with foreign governments in addressing corruption, the answer is yes. It's trying to, in some cases, request extradition of people who've been identified as corrupt. There is discussions and legislation about signing reporting requirements for financial banks and institutions so that the accounts of Chinese nationals overseas will be made available and known to the Chinese government, just like Americans overseas have to report their income. Your question about whether or not the corruption campaign is having an impact upon exports and imports, well, let me just say, generally speaking, it is in fact inhibiting or curbing back activity, generally speaking. To the extent that trade-related activities, whether it's in the production sense or the actual shipment sense affected, it will have a negative impact. Now, one direct way of having impact is that there is a lot of money leaving China. It's accelerated in the last 6 months. I don't think it's actually linked to the corruption campaign. Let me take it back, maybe a portion. It's leaving partly because the sense of the RMB appreciating is no longer there. The dollar is getting very, very strong. So those who put their money in China on the grounds that the RMB is going to appreciate vis-a-vis the dollar are pulling it out. The second reason is that Chinese households and firms are diversifying their holdings overseas. You can now fairly easily transfer your money in Chinese bank accounts overseas if you have proper documentation. You couldn't do this 6 months ago. So it's a lot easier for them to buy property in the West. But that property also is associated with the question of whether it's corruption related. There's much more auditing of property ownership in China. They're establishing a registry of ownership. So if someone owns 30 houses, it's going to become more apparent, and the question of who owns it is going to become more apparent. So lots of people are selling their stuff. So this is affecting money flows, and the trade flows are slightly different, but the trade flows are affected because they've been used to disguise capital movements. And I think you're going to see a lot more errors and omissions of movements disguised as trade, but perhaps related to the movement of capital, partly for good economic reasons, but partly because of the corruption campaign.
Yes. Please introduce yourself. And
Thank you. Song Hui-Yu with China Video News Agency of Hong Kong. I just would like to hear the panelists' takes on the recent article written by Mr. David Schomburg. Do you believe the Chinese crack-up is coming? Because he attributes his judgment to five factors. Two of them, one is economic slowdown, the other one is corruption. So I'd like to hear your takes on that.
we have any takers?
I guess since he's my colleague at GW, I need to respond. People have been predicting the downfall of the Communist Party since the beginning of the post-Mao period, maybe before. And yet it still is in power. It doesn't face an obvious organized opposition. It's got a number of challenges in front of it, but has dealt with challenging issues in the past. Despite the frustration with corruption, with the environment, with a variety of things, people tend to be optimistic about the future, expect their incomes to continue rising. Now, that may create rising expectations the party can't meet, but for now at least, they've been doing a pretty good job keeping people, in a material sense, keeping people satisfied. I think the party's been more adaptable than people often give it credit for. It's not always the most nimble of organizations, but like any other huge organization, it's slow to change, but when it does change, it addresses problems well enough to remain in power. And so I don't see any particular change coming about as a consequence of the economic slowdown. I think the party's done a pretty good job kind of getting people ready to expect a slowdown. And what's come about has not been terribly surprising. It's been a slow, gradual decline, not a bursting of a bubble. So I think for a variety of reasons, the party is in a reasonable good chance, a good place to survive. Like I said, it has challenges, but has met challenges in the past.
I might just add a couple things, but I would subscribe to what was just said, so I won't repeat all of that. I think we have to be modest what we know about economic and political developments in China, and that just speaking for myself, but I think many of my colleagues feel we've not been this uncertain about the fundamental dynamics and direction of China, certainly since 1989, and I would go back a couple of decades before that. So I think we have to be very modest about what we know and don't know and making predictions. But my instinct is very much what Professor Dickson said. I think the big question, so then you ask, why are we in this mode? Why do you get such varied predictions? And I think it stems from a very simple set of facts. And that fact is that reform since '77 has changed China. It's a much more pluralistic society. It's much bigger bureaucracy, a pluralized society. And also, society itself has been empowered in very important ways. Money, and transferring money, both internally, externally, investing it. Sort of, we'll say non-governmental groups, realizing that's a complicated concept in China. Information that Sasha was talking about. So what we have is a much more divided, complex bureaucracy in society, and we have a much more empowered society. And so the question is this new society going to accept a strongman definition of leadership? And we don't know the answer to that question. China's middle class, however you want to define it, it's probably 350 million people. I mean, that's bigger than the United States. And we have certain expectations about a middle class, but those haven't been entirely borne out, at least thus far. So I would say, while I don't agree with the broad character of the article you mentioned, you're hearing very different predictions precisely because this is such an uncertain condition that we, at least on the outside, and I think many Chinese I talk to are equally uncertain. Any hands? Yes, ma'am. Yes.
I'm Shannon Kiesman with the Diplomat magazine, and I'll direct this at you, Chris, since you were unlucky enough to actually mention it in your remarks. I want to talk a little bit about anti-corruption campaign in the PLA, and how the motivation behind that and the possible risks associated with it might be different from the general campaign.
This sounds like you.
Happy to give it a shot. First, I just want to comment on the previous discussion real quickly first. In that, and rather than, I think both points that were made are very good ones with regard to how to think about it, but I also would just submit that I think that one of the reasons we're seeing more of these kind of coming collapse voices, if you will, is that the group of people who are arguing these points seem to have what, from my perspective, is a bit of a distorted analytic lens through which they're looking at the problem. So in many ways, I think there's a school of thought that it existed for some time, especially under Hu Jintao's leadership, that China was going to move toward greater institutionalization and, you know, a lot of these things. Xi Jinping is an inconvenient truth for, for, you know, that school of thinking in the system. And the other is that there seems to be an undertone of anger in these articles. Anger at the party for, in my mind, being itself. You know, they are an authoritarian regime, and they behave like one. So it's not surprising that they haven't gone toward this opening and so on that these analysts seem to think they should have. And I think that skews their analysis. On the PLA corruption campaign, it is very different, I think, for a couple of reasons. One, Xi Jinping kind of has explained to everyone why it's different. If you go back to the first speech that he made when he did his first domestic inspection tour in Guangdong, or the speech he reportedly made, although I think it's pretty solid that he did indeed make it. One of the things he focused on was corruption in the Soviet armed forces and how the security services and the military had become lax, right? And I think it's easy for us as China modernizes and becomes, people focus more and more on China as China, the country. They also tend to think about the Chinese military as the country's military. It's not. It's the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party. And their number one job is keeping the Communist Party in power and preventing a Ceausescu scenario, you know, these sort of things. That's the PLA's number one job, as demonstrated in 1989. And so if you look at what's happened in the corruption space, especially the case of Xu Caiho, right, but there are many others, what you had in effect was a guy in charge of PLA personnel for, and I mean, you know, a lot of the media has focused on the fact that he had a metric ton of cash in his basement and so on. That's a very, you know, flashy achievement, and so it's easy for people to focus on that. But the real story is this notion that you had a guy running military personnel for 8 years who was in effect building a private army inside the armed wing of the Communist Party. These people were loyal to him, not to the party secretary. And I think sometimes it's helpful to think of the party from its Leninist point of view as a religion. And Xi Jinping is the chief priest of the religion. And so if you look at this situation where these guys who are supposed to defend you are corrupt and not reliable, that's a big problem. And I think the leadership saw this when they looked at the Egypt scenario and saw how quickly the military in Egypt turned on Mubarak, and they started to ask themselves, if we had to do 1989 over again, would these guys be responsive? And I think Xi Jinping, because of his background, having had actually something akin to military experience, the most among his colleagues, is very sensitive to that issue, and especially, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, how he sees himself as the savior of the party and so on. This is a key element, and so I would expect this to continue.
Would you agree, too, they're just simply afraid about what the fighting ability of the military in its simplest terms is?
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, it's been, it's sort of like what Dr. Huang was saying in his remarks. There's been this weird, because most militaries that are as corrupt as the PLA appears to be don't have any fighting capacity, and yet the PLA seemed to straddle that line. They were doing real training, real exercises, improving their combat capability and so on. But I think, from early on when Xi Jinping was making comments like the PLA needs to be able to fight and win wars, this is the topic he was getting at.
Yeah. Yes, we finally got this side here.
Hi everyone, my name is Sasha Blum from CCTV. I don't receive red bags for my reports. And my former colleague Chai Jing also self-funded a documentary about China's evolution, I have to say. My question is regarding anti-corruption. China pledged to sign it into law 2 days ago. And can you elaborate what the significance is and how far is China from that? And second, what are the obstacles of the U.S. to work with China on anti-corruption? Thank you.
Sasha, do you have
You want me
response?
well to answer how far away China from clear of corruption or what?
China is going to sign.
Yes.
How far is China?
I know how. Well, here's very simple. I think corruption is the result of monopoly of power. mass corruption. As well, as we all know, Lord Acton said, power corrupts absolutely, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So if the Communist Party has absolute power, it can't be rid of corruption. That's very simple. And I think the day when the Communist Party start to share power, and that's the time when we can talk about clear of corruption. That's one. And for Mr. Chai's the film, I'm very, very moved. It's just addressed a very, very basic condition of how Chinese people live. And well, it's mind-boggling for the Chinese government to ban it. It's really mind-boggling. And I think only people who wants to, cover their eyes and don't really see what's the reality. I think those people live in Beijing as well, right? Want to cover that truth because that's the truth which is uncoverable, which everywhere in Beijing. They cover you. You can't cover it.
Yukon, did I detect you had a response?
No, not to this particular question, but since we're almost finishing here, let me
Yeah.
just make two observations. One is that from an economics perspective, if China's system collapses, it won't be because of the economic slowdown. It's going to be other factors, so I don't think that's the issue. The second point I would make is that there's always discussion about political liberalization, and they usually point to the Arab Spring or they look at Indonesia. And I think that's a mistake. If you're going to look at what's going to happen in China, look for rapidly growing economies with authoritarian regimes and ask what happened, because that's China. These other regimes doing poorly, high unemployment, all sorts of problems that collapsed. But look for successful developing countries with authoritarian regimes, and then you find, of course, there aren't very many. But there is two in the region, South Korea and Taiwan economy. And I think the interesting thing is that they began political liberalization in exactly the same year, 1987, at exactly the same per capita income level, at exactly the same urbanization and service development. And I cite those factors because it creates an eco-political system that generates some of these kinds of forces, and the evolution of political liberalization is internal to the party itself, which of course is what the Communist Party has set. So I think we're actually looking quite often at the wrong kinds of possibilities to look at what's going to happen in China.
So you see China following the path, or at least it's arguably true, that it's following the path of Taiwan and South Korea, and we're just not quite there? Is that?
No, I think we have to ask the question, what are the parameters of China? This is not as I say, other countries with corruption, growth is stalled. People don't have jobs, so you have foment something, right? This is not that. This corruption actually feeds into more growth.
Yeah,
Okay?
actually, I want to add on this. Remember last year, Wang Qishan recommended the Chinese cadres to read the book about, Tocqueville's book about the French Revolution. It was a very good book. I actually read it again. I read it 30 years ago. And the basic argument was, well, when economy developed very well, when the third class or the middle class really grow, that's the time when revolution comes. And that's Tocqueville's argument, and I think Wang Qishan sees it.
And I go back to the South Korea and Taiwan examples as an economist, not a political scientist. Those economies have very similar things. They went from 20% urban to 80% urban over 30, 40 years. And precisely at a particular point in time, the economy becomes service-oriented rather than manufacturing-oriented. And the service orientation generates a different mindset among the people,
Right.
a different need for various things, a different degree of unsatisfaction when things are not being able to dealt with. And then the question is, can it generate a feeling within the system for peaceful evolution? It's going to be different, of course, and it's not smooth. But I've said much of what I read as an economist, not as a political scientist, I just see that people are using the wrong examples to try to answer this kind of a question.
Well, thank you. We'll take one more question here, and Well, we'll take two more questions because they went up at the same time, and we've got time. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Dr. Huang, where is China on the metrics by which you're looking at Taiwan and Korea?
The magic year is 2022.
Okay. Noted. Wow, that's, yes, yes.
Hi, I'm Alisa Wong, a student from Johns Hopkins. I have two questions. One is how Chinese government address this problem, and what way is the most powerful and efficient way to address this problem. Question two is most Chinese government officers they want to have more profit since they have a low salary payment. Do you think Chinese government should follow Singapore government way, increase the salary payment for all Chinese officers?
Yukon, on the latter, do you have a thought on that? Is raising wages the magic bullet here?
I mean, Singapore is a good example. The civil service salaries are global levels. Singapore also has the highest inequality in the world because people at the lower levels are paid Southeast Asian standards, people at the upper levels are paid New York standards. So I personally do not see that being able to work in a country as diverse as China. But you have a fundamental problem. You have an economy doing extremely well, heads of corporations, state corporations being paid relatively modest salaries, dealing with companies which are global companies. Globalization just makes this contrast difficult. So it is an issue. It doesn't have an easy solution. But this is part of my discussion of the fact that as long as you have a dual economy, a socialist portion with controlled state-ministered guidelines, wages, and a market, you have this tension that cannot be resolved. The only way you can resolve it is what the third plenum said. It basically said that we want to make the market dominant in allocating and pricing resources. The question is whether the government really will. Because if you don't, you're in this transition phase, and economically speaking, there's no way that you can actually eliminate corruption when you're in this no man's land, because you have this contradiction that cannot be bridged.
Actually, I would like to say raising the official salary is not the right answer because the key issue here is that who promote those officials, and in what way. If you look at Hong Kong, Singapore, and others with officials with high salary and benefit, their officials came from a very sort of a strict and highly, but the recruitment system is fair, and it's very clean. Oh, in China, actually, you don't have that, and especially at this point, you only have, you have officials who, people say, who are promoted through a corrupted way. So I don't think that will solve the problem. It may even add more anger to people.
Well, I want to thank everybody, thank the U.S. China Policy Foundation for sponsoring this, and maybe leave you just with a question that comes out of an observation that Yukon just made. The third plenum had the key phrase, make the market the decisive allocator of resources. And I suppose that raises the question, if the market is the decisive allocator, then there's an implication for the Chinese Communist Party, because in the end, the Chinese Communist Party has been the decisive allocator of resources. And so, in some sense, in moving towards the agenda they've already identified, has buried within it, I think, fundamental, certainly political tensions and probably political change. But anyway, just a thought. Have a good evening, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Good job. Thank you.
We got through.
Yeah, indeed. Unscathed, dude. Or relatively so.
Thank you. Good to see you again.
Yeah, thank you. Nice to meet you again. Yeah.
Michael, as you know, I largely blame you for my being here, because I was prepared to say, it's my spring break. Oh! And then I saw you being the monitor. Oh! I thought, man, if you're setting the standard. I
Oh,
can't be sure.
well, thank you, thank you. I did, my break's next week, so.
Oh, is that right? Yeah.
And if it had been then, I actually couldn't have, because I appreciate your sacrifice. Yeah, I wasn't trying to put you on the spot. No, with David.
No, that's it's amazing how much that op-ed has gotten traction.
Oh, yeah, I mean,
But-
yeah. My 99-year-old father in Oregon's asked me.
No kidding.
Oh, yeah. My brother in Oregon is a businessman asked me.
I guess I'd give a little more thought to it, so I have more of a, elevator response
What I
to
think,
it.
yeah.
Okay. Hi.
Just want to introduce myself, Kim.
Okay.
Nice to meet you.
Meet you. Happy to be here.
Your survey data or your conclusions coming out of it, I thought were very interesting.
Yeah, I'm weeks away from finishing the book manuscript, so it's sort of at the front of my mind. So when I read David's piece, it's like,
I mean, my first reaction is that.
yeah.
I mean, that's actually.
We're using
you can't
body
say-
language as our indicator for regime stability.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Exceptions ever been excited about media?
Well, there have been a few, but they're the exceptions.
Yeah.
I know, Fuya Bang, he actually probably got sacked for being so spontaneous.
Yeah, that's right.
He even liked the Japanese.